So this evening we are going to talk about Daniel, and all the information that we have is taken from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. This book is divided into two main parts that are quite distinctive in style of writing. Chapter 1 to 6 concerns Nebuchadnezzar, and chapter 7 to 12 concerning two other kings, Belshazzar and Darius. The texts are interspersed with first person and third person narrations, meaning that a certain part of it you have the first person speaking, I Daniel something something, so that's first person narration. Third person narration means someone talking about Daniel or talking about some other happening. And scholars believe that these passages, these texts, they came from at least two sources and was eventually compiled by a redactor. Daniel is listed as one of the prophets. In the Old Testament, we have the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then we have the so-called minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, etc. Major in the sense that they have left us lengthy writings. Minor in the sense that their writings are relatively short. And Daniel is kind of considered one of the major prophets because the book of Daniel is relatively long. But then Daniel, if you compare him to Jeremiah, Isaiah, the style of writing would be considered quite different from that. So in the Hebrew canon of the Bible, Daniel is actually grouped under the writings rather than under the prophets. But he played that role of instructing, warning, correcting, challenging the leaders as well as the people. So in a way, yes, he can be considered a prophet. Is the book of Daniel historical or allegorical? Modern scholars suggest that the book of Daniel, like Jonah, is actually an extended allegory rather than a historical book. And what we mean by that, I will explain. Now, in the book, three kings are mentioned, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. Now, but if you examine the information given, Belshazzar historically was the son of Nabonid, not as the book says, the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And Darius, the Mede, is unknown to the historians. No such person, so it's kind of a make-up character. And also the author who penned the book of Daniel make use of materials passed down from the 6th century BC. But when you look at the content, the methods that really concerned him was actually the issue of the 2nd BC centuries. He was actually addressing readers of the 2nd BC century. So he was actually kind of using some historical names, but presenting a narration in such a way to fit the needs of his later readers. What was the historical background that motivate the author to write this book? Now, 2nd century BC, the Seleucids of the Greek Empire, led by Antiochus IV, attempted to suppress the Jewish culture and religion. This concerted effort of suppression, the details can be found in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. But also historically, that was the situation. Now he prohibited Jewish practices and imposed worship of the pagan gods. What really kind of agitated the Jews during that time, that he went so far as to erect an altar to Zeus and sacrifice a pig in the temple. And we know that for the Jews that was a big no-no. If we look at the books of Maccabees, then we see the story about the Jewish revolt against Antiochus, because that was really too much. The way he tried to suppress their religion and culture, and to the extent of kind of the most sensitive aspects of their religion was touched on. And so that led eventually to the revolution, insurgency of Judas Maccabeus. So that cultural molestation of the Jews and the profanations of the temple by Antiochus IV provoked that Maccabean revolt. And the Jews during that time need to be encouraged, need to be supported to kind of help them to persevere in the most difficult time of their history. It is a little bit like the book of Revelations during the New Testament era. In the early church, the Christians were persecuted by the Romans, and so the book of Revelation was written to encourage the Christian in the early centuries to persevere in their faith, not to succumb to the persecution of the Romans. Similarly, during the 2nd century BC, the Jews were encouraged. They needed that kind of encouragement, that support, that assurance that God was with them. And the book of Daniel, although used historical personality like Nebuchadnezzar, which is actually of the 6th century, but actually the intention was to encourage the people of the 2nd century BC. So the writing of Daniel was meant to encourage the Jews during that time of persecution, just like Revelation was written to encourage the early Christians during the Roman persecutions of the early church. They were used to urge the people to be faithful to their religious practices. For the Jews, then that would be loyalty to their food laws. That is the very clear external sign of their faith. And also, obviously, the more important part, refusal to worship pagan gods. So if you look at the content of the book of Daniel, then you understand why the author seems to be very precise about certain information of the 2nd century. Yet when he was talking about historical matters of the 6th century, he was not so precise, because that was not his main concern. He was just using informations and personalities of that time, but with the intention of encouraging people of his time. The name of Daniel means God is my judge. He was also given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, meaning may he protect his life. And of course, in the Babylonian context, that he refers to the Babylonian god. In the story, we have 3 other characters, Daniel's friends, known as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they were also given Chaldean names in the book. So it is said that during the Babylonian exile, Daniel and his three friends were among the exile. And the oppressor, the Babylonian, they wanted some of these Jewish people who are healthy, young, intelligent, to serve in the Babylonian court also. So these four men, they were among the selected to be trained for the service of the court. Now, during the training period, the young men were supposed to be given the best of food and education and so forth to prepare them well for the eventual jobs. And the food that was served to them, some of the food would be considered unclean by the Jewish laws. And Daniel was very anxious that he should not eat those food that was defiled. And apparently he was on good terms with the chief eunuch who oversees their meals and so forth. And so he bargained with the eunuch to allow them special diet, the food that exclude those prohibited food by the Jewish laws. And he asked that a 10 days trial be given to show that even without those food, they could remain very healthy and strong. And somehow the eunuch agreed to that agreement. And after the trial period, the four men, they are as strong and perhaps even stronger than the other young men under training. So Daniel and his friends' faithfulness to God was rewarded. God granted them great wisdom and knowledge, and their intelligence and knowledge so impressed the king that they won his favor and were appointed to high positions in the court. One day, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He saw an enormous statue. You can see in this image, this statue with a head of gold, the breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron, yet feet of mixed iron and clay. Then in that vision, he saw that the statue was destroyed by the rock that turned into a mountain filling the whole earth. So the king asked his soothsayers, all those advisors and so forth, to help him interpret the dream, but they could not. So the king ordered them all to be killed. And Daniel is supposed to be one of the advisors, and so he was also supposed to be killed. So when Daniel found out that this issue, that the king had a dream, but nobody seems to be able to interpret, he somehow managed to convince the king's officers to let him go and talk to the king. But before that, he bargained for some time, and then he consulted, discussed with his three friends, and then they prayed to God for mercy. And during that night, the mystery of the vision was revealed to Daniel. So somehow Daniel was given the opportunity to see the king, and then he explained the dream to the king, that the statue symbolized four successive kingdoms, starting from Nebuchadnezzar himself, and then the other metals, silver, bronze, and all that, different parts of the body represent the other kingdoms after his. But this series, these four kingdoms, would be crushed by God's kingdom, which would endure forever. In the story, surprisingly, the king accepted the invitation. And we would expect the king to be very upset, very angry. Well, what do you mean? My kingdom is going to be destroyed and so forth. But somehow the king accepted his interpretations. Not only that he accepted the interpretations, but he professed his faith in Daniel's God, that your God must be the God of gods, the master of kings, the revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Now, we mentioned that the ancient people had that perception that each group of people had their own God, and the God may be named differently. So your God may be known as Baal, my God known as Yahweh, etc., etc. But somehow there is a greatest God who will reign even over other gods. And in this case, the King Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged that the Jewish God Yahweh is the God of all gods. But of course, we mentioned that this is wrong understanding of God. There is only one God. There cannot be so many gods, and that all the gods are fighting, and there's only one God who is greatest that somehow will win over the rest. That's not the case. But people do have misunderstanding about God. Um, on this topic, you may want to refer to my previous talk earlier. One of them is on the angry God, which also talk about other misconceptions about God for ancient people. Anyway, because of his contribution, and so Daniel was put in charge of all the soothsayers and the astrologers and other wise men in the kingdom. But he looks after his three friends also, and he insisted that they should also be promoted. Sometime later, King Nebuchadnezzar elected a golden statue and ordered everyone to worship it. That was partly through the instigation of his other advisors, um, to kind of consolidate his rule or his power, and he was advised that the people should worship him, and so that order was made. Daniel's three companions refused to bound to that instruction and to refuse to bow to the statue of the king, and they were ordered to be thrown into the fiery furnace. But surprisingly, even in the burning furnace, they were walking in a very casual manner, talking, and there seems to be a fourth person in their midst, talking to them. And these three young men were able to praise God even while burning. And the king was very astonished to see them unharmed, and wonder what happened. So the key person is that mysterious figure among them, someone with the appearance like the son of gods. So the king ordered that the three young men be released. They be taken out of the furnace, and he also started to bless the God of Israel, and also to decree that everyone who blasphemed against the God of Israel then should be torn limb from limb. In the book of Daniel, there is a song called the Song of the Three Young Men. the Song of Praise, uh, that has become a classic, uh, and is used in the Liturgy of the Hours and other church prayers. So if some of you who follow the Liturgy of the Hours, the Divine Office, you will come across this Song of Praise of the three young men, and their names are being mentioned. Then we have the second vision of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. In that dream, there was a huge tree that was suddenly cut down at the command of heavenly messengers. Here, I just want to make a remark that this account is preceded by another introduction of how Daniel was called to serve in the court. So this can be seen as a proof that the eventual work of the book of Daniel is actually a redaction, making use of different sources of material and then eventually compile them into that final edition. And the style of writing is of first person narration with very dramatic contents. It means in this section, it is Daniel himself speaking first person. Daniel was summoned to interpret the dream, and he interpreted it. The tree was Nebuchadnezzar himself, who for 7 years would lose his mind, gone crazy, and live like a wild beast. Apparently, the dream came true, but at the end of the specific time, when Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged uh, God's sovereignty, and he was restored to his health and his kingdom. You can see that this part, the narration is very dramatic, very unexpected kind of things, and that you look at this picture being drawn, like he really became very wild. Um, you can see that the content is a exaggeration, therefore most likely not historically true, but it's just meant to convey a message. And then after the discussion about Nebuchadnezzar, then suddenly there's an introduction of another king called Belshazzar. And in the book of Daniel, it is said that he is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. But of course, historically, historian realized that Nebuchadnezzar did not have such a son. So this is a make-up personality. Now, anyway, in the book of Daniel, Belshazzar gave a great banquet, and he used the golden and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was sacked by the Babylonian, and then the people brought in exile, and so he used those vessels for his banquet. And during the banquet, suddenly a ghostly hand appeared and wrote on the wall. When that happened, then the king became very shocked, and he did not know what to do. And then it was on that occasion that the queen remembered Daniel and recommended to the king that, yeah, you should ask Daniel to come forward to interpret the dream for you. She recommended him as the one in whom lives the Spirit of God Most High. So when Daniel came, forefront, he stated very clearly that he did not want any rewards. but he will interpret the dream. So he interpreted the words written on the wall, mene, mene, tekel, and parsin, meaning God has measured your sovereignty and put an end to it. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And again, surprisingly, despite the harsh words, the king accepted the interpretation and clothed Daniel in purple and placed a gold chain around his neck and proclaimed him the third highest rank in the kingdom. And in the story, somehow the king died that night. And then his son Darius took over. Again, Darius is not a historical person, a make-up personality in the book of Daniel. Historians have not found such a person. And the introduction of Darius in this chapter was also very abrupt, and historians assert his non-existence. Anyway, this is an allegory, so in the allegory, you can create characters. Now, the enemies were jealous of Daniel, and they looked for a way to get rid of him. So they tricked the king into issuing an edict that would forbid anyone from praying or worshipping anyone other than the king. Somehow, the king accepted his advisor's recommendation, and so he signed a document and with his seal, with a ring, meaning that that edict could not be revoked. Now, in spite of the prohibition that no one should pray to any other gods, but that have to bow to worship the king, Daniel prayed in full view of the public. And of course, the conspirators caught him in the act and rushed to tell King Darius. And the king was in a dilemma because, yeah, he has issued the edict. So now, although he liked Daniel, but can't be helped. So Daniel was supposed to be punished. And the punishment was to throw him into the lion's den. Yet, early the next morning, the king was overjoyed when he found Daniel was completely unharmed. And as a result, he had the conspirators thrown into the dam to be killed by the lions. He then issued a decree saying that all his people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. Subsequently, Daniel became prosperous. So you see a similar theme running down through the chapters of the book of Daniel, that Daniel was persecuted, opposed by some bad people. The king somehow listened to the bad advice, but somehow God rescued him, God rescued his friends because of their faithfulness to God. So the more interesting stories are contained in the first 6 chapters, chapter 1 to 6. Chapter 7 and 8 speak of the vision of the beast from the sea using third person narration, and the vision of the ram and goat in first person narration. And this vision is supposed to occur during the reign of the second king, Belshazzar. The meaning of those visions are known. Chapter 9 speaks of the prophecy of the 70 weeks occurring during the time of Darius. Daniel was praying and confessing his own sin and the sin of Israel, and then he pleaded for God to restore Israel and the temple. Remember, Jerusalem was sacked, they were brought in exile. And Angel Gabriel explained that the 70 years stood for 70 weeks of years, meaning 490 years, during which the temple will first be restored, then later defiled by a prince. So we know that eventually the Jews, they were allowed to return to Palestine and to rebuild their Jerusalem. That was after hundreds of years in exile in Babylon. Chapters 11 to 13 speak of other visions of Daniel. They were about the various wars among the nations, but the specific meaning are not known. In chapter 12, there is an apocalyptic passage which describes the final victory of the just and the everlasting shame of the sinners. And the final verses, the remaining time to the end was revealed. A time, times, and a half a time means 3 years and a half. It was an illusion that the trying period would be temporarily. We know that 7 is supposed to be a perfect number. So half of 7, 3.5, signifies a temporary period. So this is the final verse that gives encouragement to the persecuted Jews. That's about all about the content of the book of Daniel. What are the lessons? 1. Endurance and hope. Daniel and his companions, they endured persecution, but because of their faithfulness to God, God rescued them from the harms and dangers. Although the whole story is fictitious, but the story is meant to convey that message of endurance and hope. St. Paul, in his letters to the Romans, says we can boast about our sufferings. This suffering brings patience, as we know, and patience brings perseverance, and perseverance brings hope. If we have faith and trust in God, then in spite of the hardships, we are able to endure. Lesson 2, to praise God even in difficult times. The 3 friends of Daniel, they walk in the heart of the flames, but still praising and blessing God. It is a reminder to all believers to praise God in good times as well as in bad. We should not only praise God when everything is smooth and okay. Even in difficult times, we can and we should continue to praise God because that same God is with us in good times and in bad. And praising God changes our hearts. It changes our mindsets. When we praise God, our focus is shift from us, from our difficulties, from our sufferings, and allow us to focus on God. It shifts us from problems to solutions, from pain to promise, and from hurt to hope. Third point, the transient nature of these worldly kingdoms. Although the book of Daniel is fictitious, but the prophecy of the rising and fallings of kingdoms is a description of historical facts. We look at the whole history of mankind in different parts of the world. Kingdom established, kingdom destroy, one kingdom after another, and so forth. A worldly kingdom is not enduring. So the message is clear that the worldly political kingdom is passing. Only the kingdom of heaven endures forever. We do not agree with Daniel's theology of food law that you cannot eat this food, cannot eat that food, and therefore you have in the story that Daniel refused to eat certain food and ask for specific diet during the training period, etc. Neither do we agree with the Old Testament ancient people's conception that there are many gods, only one of them is the greatest. But what is important is that we admire him for his faithfulness and trust in God, in spite of his faulty theology. So we have to ask ourselves, how have we lived our faith with conviction and commitment? We have our own conviction and commitment. Today, our theology is definitely much improved than ancient theology. But even today, we may have some misconception about God and so forth. But in spite of our lack of adequate knowledge, what is most important is our faith in God and our trust in Him. So my talk on Daniel ends here today.